welcome to the Wigton Book Festival, and thank you very much indeed for joining us. I'm Sheena MacDonald, I'm a journalist, and today it's my privilege and huge pleasure to introduce to you the author of this book, The Lost Pianos of Siberia, Sophy Roberts. Sophie, hello.
Thank you very much.
Joining us from Dorset. I'm here in Scotland's national book town, but for the next hour, we're all going to be far, far away.
Must be drunk with me.
Let's get on with the conversation, and I'd like to thank you for what honestly is an extraordinary book. It's an absolute page turner, and it recounts the months you spent exploring the territory and indeed the history of Siberia. And it's a cornucopia of a book, as we'll find out over the next hour. Insofar as most of us know anything about Siberia, it's a place of cruelty, of banishment, of exile. What should we know about it and where it is?
Well, that's a great place to start. And thank you, Sheena, for that kind introduction. Siberia is as much an idea as it is a place. So I think it's incredibly important for me to, first of all, explain the Siberia that I'm working with in this book and over the last 4 or 5 years of work in the field. Siberia starts in the Ural Mountains. which is that line of mountain you see stretching up through the continent. And it ends, by my definition, on the coast of Kamchatka, out there in the Pacific. Now, the reason I use that definition, which is a very loose one, is because of something that Anton Chekhov said. And it was a beautiful description. He said, Siberia begins in the city of Ekaterinburg and it ends, and he used this phrase, goodness knows where. And that gave me the kind of latitude to go far and wide across this vast territory, which indeed covers a huge 9 different time zones. You've got the Arctic in the north, you've got the steppe country in the south, and you've got the great Siberian taiga forest through the middle. You're right, it has a gruesome reputation, as it deserves in its deep history. Just by example, 1801 to 1917, when it was the Tsarist penal exile system. We're talking about 1 million subjects banished to Siberia in that time. During the Gulag period, 1929 to 1953, highly contentious numbers, but 2.7 million forced laborers died in that Soviet Gulag, staggering numbers. But, and this is very important, and perhaps I'll do a short reading just to kick things off here, which Siberia is a lot more than that as well, which is what my book starts to explore. So if I may, I'll just read a section from the beginning.
Please do.
Siberia is far more significant than a place on the map. It's a feeling which sticks like a burr. A temperature, the sound of sleepy flakes falling on snowy pillows, and the crunch of uneven footsteps coming from behind. Siberia is a wardrobe problem, too cold in winter and too hot in summer, with wooden cabins and chimney stacks belching corpse grey smoke into wide, white skies. It is a melancholy, a cinematic romance dipped in limpid moonshine, unhurried train journeys, pipes wrapped in sackcloth, and a broken swing hanging from a squeaky chain. You can hear Siberia in the big soft chords in Russian music that evoke the hush of silver birch trees and the billowing winter snows. Covering 1/11 of the world's landmass, Siberia is bordered by the Arctic Ocean in the north and the Mongolian steppe in the south. The Urals mark the western edge and the Pacific its eastern rim. It's the ultimate land beyond the rock, as the Urals used to be described, an unwritten register of the missing and the uprooted, an almost country, perceived to be so far from Moscow that when some kind of falling star destroyed a patch of forest twice the size of the Russian capital in the famed Tunguska event of 1908, no one bothered to investigate for 20 years. Before air travel reduced distances, Siberia was simply too far to go for anyone to look. In the 17th century, wilderness was therefore ideal for banishing criminals and dissidents when the Tsars first transformed Siberia into the most feared penal colony on earth. Some exiles had their nostrils split to mark them as outcasts. Others had their tongues removed. Among them, ordinary, innocent people labelled convicts on the European side of the Urals and unfortunates in Siberia. Hence, the habit among fellow exiles of leaving free bread on windowsills to help bedraggled newcomers. Empathy, it seems, has been seared into the Siberian psyche from the start. With these small acts of kindness, the difference between life and death in an unimaginably vast realm. Siberia's size also stands as testimony to our human capacity for indifference. We find it difficult to identify with places that are too far removed. That's what happens with boundless scale. The effects are dizzying until it's hard to tell truth from fact, whether Siberia is a nightmare or a myth full of impenetrable forests and limitless plains, its murderous proportions strung with groaning oil derricks and sagging wires. Siberia is all these things and more as well.
Thank you very much for that. And that's an excellent passage to read because it encapsulates as I said, it's a cornucopia, it's a tessellation, and you tell so many different stories in this book. Let me just pick you up on a couple of things before we get onto the main story. The wardrobe problem. too cold in winter, too hot in summer. And you know that personally, don't you?
Yeah, no, it was beastly, the wardrobe problem. That line actually came from a wonderful old lady on the shores of Lake Baikal who told me off. And she said, she gave me that line, wardrobe, it's a wardrobe problem, too cold in winter, too hot in summer. And she says to me, just dress properly. I couldn't be more put it back into my box if I tried. But I found it really, really hard because in winter, you dress properly, it's fine. I mean, it goes down to -40 some of the times I was there. Summer, I found really, really hard because of the mosquito, which in Siberian legend, born from the ashes of a cannibal. And they are unbelievable if you catch the wrong season. And I had a very bad allergic reaction when I was working in Kolyma, right on that far northeast rim of Russia. It was tough, but yeah, so I preferred winter. It's also much more magical in winter, to be honest.
Now let's talk about how you came to find yourself in Siberia. I mean, you have established a reputation as a very, very intrepid journalist. You go to lesser known parts of the world, from the Congo to Papua New Guinea. Was Siberia somewhere you'd always wanted to explore?
Yeah, when I was a kid, I had a globe on my bedside table that was a light up globe. Do you remember? They used to sell them in W.H. Smith. And it had this huge half of the globe was this big white space, Siberia. So it's always been in my head. And then as a teenage girl, like lots of teenage girls, I fell in love with Omar Sharif and and also in 1718, the 19th century literature of Tolstoy and the greats. So it was always in my head in a romantic way. But when I first set my feet on the ground there, it was on an assignment for the Financial Times, who I do some freelance work for. And that was when something clicked and it grabbed me. It stuck like a kind of burr and pulled me in for a very long time and to deep and interesting parts of the territory.
You used one key word in your reading, and that is music, which of course is an essential element in the Russian tradition and soul indeed. And in fact, it was music that was the catalyst for this book. Can you tell us about that?
Yeah, it's interesting because the story didn't begin in Siberia. It began in Mongolia. I had been going to Mongolia for many years. I've got 2 sons, and we go with our kids, my husband and I, and we stay with some friends. He's German, she is Mongolian, and they have 3 children. They brought them up in Mongolia in a remote area called the Orkhon Valley, which is about 8 hours outside of Ulaanbaatar. And it was in this valley above unimaginably beautiful. I think there's a photograph of it you can see. Yeah. And that silver river that snakes below, absolutely nothing all around, just the herders. And these wonderful Mongolian tents, which are called gers, and they've got the most spectacular acoustics because they're felt lined with a small hole in the middle that the smoke rises out of. And in the summer of 2015, there was a pianist playing there. She was teaching some of the herder children piano, and she was playing on a Yamaha that had seen better times. It was out of sorts. I didn't hear it being out of sorts. I heard pure beauty. She was playing Bach, and it was on an evening, the stars above, the fire crackling, 20 of us or so in this very intimate environment. And I was moved. And I leant over to my German friend and I said, good God, this is really something very special. And he was rather despairing and said, no, the piano is not good enough for her talent. A pianist called Ogdarel Sampilnorov. And he said to me, he's a storyteller himself, and he said, we must go find her one of the Lost Pianos of Siberia. And he fed the line that became the book. It became a quest that became the book. And so Mongolia doesn't have any pianos that were deserving of it. So I dipped across the other side of the border, not so far away, and started to discover an extraordinary relationship with the piano that spread right into these kind of, frozen reaches.
And did Franz Christoph know about the Lost Pianos of Siberia, or did he just pluck that notion from the air?
He's German, and the German musical tradition is richly bound to the Russian one. And he had read a brilliant biography, which he handed to me that night, it's Walker's biography of Franz Liszt, which talked about a particular moment in Russian piano mania, which we can come on to. But also, he also was very aware of the relationship of the German makers and how they affected the Russian piano industry. So he had the ideas in the back of his head. And also, there's a wonderful book called Daniel Mason, The Piano Tuner. It's a piece of fiction about a great grand piano going up into the forests and the jungles of Myanmar, Burma. Yeah. And it's a wonderful, wonderful book. And Franz Christoph said to me, there's no need to make it up. This can be for real. Why can't we have a wonderful piano in the middle of this steppe at the head of a river? So it was an eccentric idea, but, fun.
Well, now, non-spoiler alert. If you want to find whether Odd Girl Sampilinarov gets her piano, you will have to read this book, and I absolutely encourage you to do so, because it's a treasury of it's mighty, it's pulsating, it's tragicomic, it embraces fact, fiction, history, and as Sophie's just said, apart from being a great book about Siberia, it's an amazing book about the Russian love affair with the piano. We'll come on to Liszt, but the Russian love affair with the piano, I presume, is rooted in the importance of music through the human voice, through the folk tradition. How did the piano become so important to 19th century Russia, or Siberia in particular?
It really starts a little bit earlier with Catherine the Great at the end of the 18th century. Catherine was a great Anglophile, and anything that was fashionable in England, whether it was gardens, indeed Scotland, architects, or music, she had to get her hands on. And that included one of these very early keyboard instruments, a Zumpe, a square piano that was made in London by a German, and that piano rather remarkably still exists. It survived the war in Siberia, which is a story that you can read about in the book. But she started the fashion, and it was her daughter-in-law, Maria Fyodorovna, who went to Vienna and heard that very famous duel between Mozart and Clementi. And she was struck by this instrument, and she was struck, Clementi was quick to act, and he was soon selling pianos in Russia and encouraging his effectively performing monkey, the Irish pianist and composer John Field, to make hay. This is a phrase from a wonderful set of letters which we can see. Make hay while the sun shines. And these piano makers, Clementi and also quickly the German, they couldn't make pianos quick enough, and a piano mania was unleashed. You had there's one wonderful critic's description of sort of round about 1830 who says, if you was 100 apartments in St. Petersburg, 96 of them have a piano in them, and there will be a piano tuner shared among them. So it was a real craze. And Maria Fyodorovna also introduced a state subsidy system, which meant the pianos were rather cheap. So everybody could have them. And of the bourgeoisie, this is.
Well, I was going to say, yes. Sorry, I'll let you finish, yes.
Well, then what happens is if you imagine Moscow and St. Petersburg completely alive with these instruments, at the same time, the privileged of those two areas are moving across the territory into Siberia as governors' wives, explorers, and also a few very wealthy political exiles who took their pianos with them. So you start to see this spread of the piano into the remote territory of Siberia.
Yes, I mean, you were describing earlier the vastness, the absolute vastness of Siberia, but that seemed to be no barrier to piano lovers who were transporting their instruments. Actually, before we come on to that, you mentioned Franz Liszt, and I think perhaps you ought to say a little bit about how he electrified what was already a huge enthusiasm.
Yeah, I mean, Franz Liszt was the kind of Rolling Stone of the generation. He came in with these virtuosos. There was many of them, and the virtuosos, of course, made it a real super fashion, of a craze. And Franz Liszt, his performances were particularly spectacular because the women would grab at his hair to wear in lockets around their necks. They'd pick up the cherry pips he spat out to wear as lucky amulets. It was kind of extraordinary. And Franz Liszt did give some blistering performances, which are wonderfully documented in the Russian archives. So he was a real motivator for what became a very unique relationship with the piano in Russia.
Yes, what I was going to say was that the vast distances didn't prove to be a barrier to people who wanted to transport pianos, and they did. But how did they? I mean, how do you get as lumbersome a thing as a piano from the Urals to the western coast of Siberia?
Well, it was sort of the absurdity of that whole idea that got me into the idea of the book in the first place. Because, you know, pianos are not like violins. It's a big commitment to, even in this day and age, get one into a room in an Edinburgh apartment. So imagine traveling 3,000, 4,000, 5,000 miles into this hinterland when there was no railway. The railway didn't happen until the beginning of the 20th century, really. So there was one track called the Great Siberian Tract, which ran from the capital all the way to the Pacific coast. Best traveled in winter, because at least the ground was frozen, hellish in spring when it turned to mud, and in summer, of course, the blooms of mosquitoes. And so these pianos and clavichords and other instruments would be dragged on the back of a sledge. And I liked that whole idea because, of course, does that not show love? Does that not show commitment? Does that not show obsession?
Yes, certainly obsession. Yes.
And you know, the wonderful stories of sort of princesses and mavericks and misfits and the rest of them all pulling these instruments over those mountains and into the back of beyond.
Is it easier to get around Siberia now? I mean, how? In fact, I think should we have another shot of trying a video and see if it works? But before we do that, how did you get around Siberia? And did you manage to traverse from the eastern? I mean, as you say, it's not formal, but from the Urals to the far west.
Yeah, I did. I mean, there is now this wonderful railway that I'm sure many of the listeners and readers of the book will know themselves, the Great Trans-Siberian, and that functions very, very well. It's always on time. It is an incredibly clear line. It's inexpensive. I was jumping on and off using the local trains, the cheapest tickets possible, and it really worked. But as soon as you come off that line, you have to work differently. Modern Siberia is very well connected with a patchwork of airlines. But when you go off that patchwork, you have to do something else to get around. So I was highly opportunistic. I hitched rides with oil and gas workers. I hitched rides with helicopters that were bringing indigenous children back to and from their boarding schools. I hitched rides with snowmobiles. It kind of any means I could, I had to. And that was great fun. It put the serendipity back into the act of travel and also actually revealed this incredibly hospitable heart of Siberians, which I came to have such a profound affection for.
Yes, I'm very keen to talk about some of the people you met, but should we have a go at seeing this video? It was shot by a friend of yours, Michael, and he deserves a credit as well because his images are terrific.
Yeah, indeed. Michael Turek, he's an American photographer, and he was also shooting some documentary work at the same time. A very, very close friend and colleague.
Let's see if we can see this.
8 of the 10.
Really hope this machine it's just broken. Adventurer you are. You said the bourgeoisie fell in love with the piano, and many of them had them, and there were Russian piano makers as well as Germans, as well as exporters or importers. Did the man and woman in the street fall in love with the piano? Were they able to?
That really happened after the revolution. The Becker piano making factory was the great grand Steinway of Russia, really. And then the revolution occurs, and that factory was nationalized, and it became the Red October factory. And this was a really, really important moment for the piano in Russian and Siberian culture, because the piano became very inexpensive. Forget the state subsidies that the Tsarist regime had propped up in order to allow more people to afford them. This was a true democratization of an instrument. And these Red October pianos, modest uprights, not a great sound, but good enough, would be just distributed all over the former USSR. Into places that you would just never think would have a music school or a house of culture, but they did. And that is why very early on, when I was working on this, I met the Russian concert pianist Denis Matsuev, who was born in Siberia. And I'd heard him play at Carnegie Hall in New York, and I was hassling him and trying to get his help. And, I needed lots of help with this project. And eventually, when he sat down with me in Moscow, he said to me, the audience in Russia is completely different from the Carnegie Hall audience. But the audience in Siberia is different again. And he described their incredibly attentive, suspicious silences because their musical education is very high. Of course, with Perestroika, that has faded, but it's true. So I found this rather wonderful thing, which was when I knocked on the door of a Siberian home and said, "Have you got a piano?" One, it was very neutralizing, politically neutralizing. I'm an English journalist going into tricky territory in the time of Putin. Neutralizing. It's music is a common base from where we can both find something to talk over the kitchen table. And indeed, it became as a Russian consul to, or English consul to Russia during the time of the revolution, he called the piano a passport in Russia. It opens doors. And that was the magic of using the object, if you will, to be able to tell the story about Russia's history and its relationship with the piano. But that Soviet period and the democratization of the instrument, not just for grand concert halls, but in more intimate spaces, was something that I found uniquely affecting and compelling.
You mentioned Catherine the Great's influence. The revolution, was it actually Lenin himself who was the great piano democratizer?
Yes, I mean, it began under him, but it kept on happening with those that followed. I mean, he and Stalin, all of them had spent their own time in Siberia.
I know they were in exile themselves and then survived.
Yeah, so, Siberia is always incredibly bound to the psyche of Moscow and Petersburg, but it was the they were trying to bring all these disparate indigenous groups under control as well, like any colonizing impetus. And the piano represented a means to do that as well, isn't it? Because it's a European instrument, it's a Western instrument, it signifies a certain part of culture. And that's what I also found compelling and a bit absurd, is that it was going into regions where, for instance, one area up in the Yamal, in the Arctic, where these people, they're called the nenets. Piano is an absurdity. They only carry as much as they can put on the back of a sledge. They're moving 800 kilometers a year with their migrating reindeer. Why would there be a piano in their culture? But yet you dig, you find, and I found a nenet composer. Indeed, I found a German piano with him. I mean, it was kind of extraordinary.
Oh, you found so many fascinating individuals. I mean, there isn't time to go through all of them, but let's talk about some of them. And people who helped him, and as you say, the piano and the hunt for the pianos was a passport for experience, and there are images of some of them. For instance, the president of the Siberian Piano Tuners Association, he was a character.
Yeah, he was great. Burikov, he was wonderful, and he helped me. This was in Novosibirsk. I mean, finding instruments in private hands, finding instruments with significant stories, finding instruments that told something bigger than told something more than just was able to play a piece of music. That's what mattered to me. And the tuners, like this gentleman, Burikov, were key to unraveling those private contacts. And this gentleman was particularly brilliant. There was another gentleman in Kamchatka who he opened up his notebooks, and his notebooks he'd been keeping for 50 years. Every single piano he'd ever tuned, and with a story, was noted with the serial number. And so I had this kind of archive that just hadn't been touched. And it was also an archive, which I'm sure, Sheena, you'll appreciate as a journalist. It's an archive that belonged to the underdog. Yeah. The piano tuner is never named. The piano tuner is never the star of the show. They come on in the interval, they fix it up, they make it perfect, and the virtuoso gets all the glory. I love an underdog. So these piano tuners became very important characters in my book, as well as leads that led me elsewhere.
Well, and also, they have a proper conceit of themselves and their expertise. And I mean, the photograph of Biryukov we saw there, is that him with the Steinway Grand that he thinks was played by the Leningrad Philharmonic in exile?
That's correct. So during the Great Patriotic War, as they call it in Russia, the Second World War to us, that Novosibirsk, which is effectively the capital of Siberia, it's right in the middle, was a very important place because it had Stalin, while everyone was fighting the war and death on every front, he was building the largest opera house in Russia. And it still is to this day. And it's a remarkable building. And Birikov helped me get into the sort of story of that opera house, which during the war was also used as a storehouse for state treasures. So when the siege of Leningrad starts to lock out, and they very quickly evacuate treasures from the state hermitage, from the Tsarist palaces, including that piano I referenced referenced at the beginning of our conversation that belonged to Catherine the Great.
Oh.
And they snuck them out on these amazing train journeys, going through bombings and bombardments and 6 weeks, 8 weeks, and snuck them into the opera house where for safekeeping. That included the prima ballerinas, it included the musicians, and it included the Leningrad Philharmonic, and of course, who played Shostakovich's great symphony during the war. And what is fascinating about it is Birikov believes this Steinway came with that orchestra. I couldn't verify it. Provenance is hard in Russia. It's hard after such a disturbed history, but he was an absolute key to the kingdom on so many levels.
You mentioned that the Leningrad Shostakovich's seventh, the Leningrad Symphony. Is there not a famous recording of that? And we seem to hear artillery in the background. But was that the Leningrad Philharmonic playing, or was it?
No, it wasn't. It was the Philharmonic Orchestra was taken out to Siberia. They played it later. With Shostakovich went to Siberia to hear them play it because they were the first orchestra. They were the ones that should have played it.
Yes.
But they evacuated because they were considered state treasures. So it was another city orchestra that performed inside Leningrad during the siege, when indeed you can hear there's various stories, but one of them is that it was the Germans were so incredibly moved by this music, which was blasted through the city on loudspeakers, that they stopped the bombardments. But yes, it was right during this terrible time.
Oh, you want that to be true, don't you? Let's talk about some other. I mean, Novosibirsk turned out to be a bit of a hotbed of music lovers. The Lomachenkos family were extraordinary.
Yes, so this is this slide you'll see now. They were wonderful. The Lomachenkos, that room they're in is at the basement of the Novosibirsk Opera House. They're a family of musicians. And it's the same room where the Tsar's carpet was rolled out for a bed during the Second World War. And in that room, I found this man in blue, who is in the Opera House Orchestra. He plays the viola. And the man on the right is his father, Vasily. And Vasily drove trucks in the Altai Mountains, which is a really brutal, cold bit of Siberia, beautiful, but very, very cold bit of Siberia. And he drove trucks, and it was a miserable life. It was dangerous roads, brutal temperatures, and he was a brilliant mind. And he thought, I don't want my children to live this life. And so he sold his modest home, and with a quarter of the money, he bought a piano in the belief that music would give his family a different future. It was the belief in education and in a musical education, and indeed it did. And all the generations you see there, including the little boy, have committed themselves to music, and they become incredibly important characters in my book. Kostya on the left, a gifted tuner, and became very good friends to me as well in the course of my research.
So you say Yeltsin was catastrophic for the piano, but this family have survived that catastrophe. But what happened?
With Perestroika?
Yes.
And it's basically people were the economy collapsed, so you sold whatever you could. You chopped up pianos to make firewood. I found an amazing piano that was sold for $100. It was something that echoed what happened in the war. I found another piano that was a beautiful Bechstein that was bought for a bag of potatoes. But Perestroika had a massive effect on the economy, and obviously people just shifted and got rid of things and sold things and tossed things out the window if they had to move on fast. What was very interesting as well, of course, is that the piano industry worldwide has suffered because of electronic music, because of the Chinese synthesizer. So that was also bashing at the door to affect the industry at large. But what I discovered is that those who had held onto their instruments had done so with real care, and there was a reason for it that usually was about more than music. It was about family, lost, love affairs, tragedy, and memory. And that's if you like, what I was delving into with this book. It was and I will mention it because it was a very powerful influence on me, but Edmund de Waal's The Hare with Amber Eyes.
Yes.
He talks in there about how objects are, lost, stolen, retrieved, given as gifts, but it's how you tell their stories that matters. And if you like, the piano is the lens on a part of the world that is much misunderstood. And like I say, it became my passport to enter people's lives and understand their stories.
Well, you've told the stories beautifully, and there are many doughty individuals remain who maintain the Russian, to use your phrase, the Russian belief in music's comforts. Can you tell us about the Aeroflot navigator who turned out to be a bit of a piano hoarder in the end, Leonid Koloshin, who was generous and humane to a fault? Why? What was in it for him?
Leonid was great. Leonid was living in the Altai that I was talking about, this quite tough mountainous area in the south of Siberia. And he was a former Aeroflot navigator, and he'd ended up falling in love with this part of Russia because of a particular, there was a particular influence, somebody called, oh God, it's completely off my head now, Nicholas Roerich, who was this sort of Russian kind of mystic character. And Roerich was also a great believer in culture as a way to uplift people, and that just because you were poor or you lived in a remote place, you should still have access to great culture. And Leonid, when he arrived in these Altai mountains, where Roerich had also spent some time, encountered a little boy playing a piano that was painted onto a kitchen table. And he thought that was a great pity. So he went back to Moscow and brought him back a piano that somebody else was throwing out. And to the enormous joy of this child. So I'll go back to Leonid, who was the Aeroflot navigator. And he said to me, he distributed something like 42 of these instruments to children of the Altai. And when I met him, he barely had enough money to buy firewood, but he was building a concert hall with the favors of friends at the back of his cottage in the Altai. And he was very funny because I asked him if he knew of any instrument that I might be able to track down from my friend Ogdarel. And he said, no, but if you find one, Sophie, will you let me know as well? Because I could do with an instrument for my concert hall. And I said, but Leonid, you live so far away. This is so remote. And he looked at me without a smile on his face. He goes, no, Sophie, the world is very remote. We are at the center. And it was a wonderful moment because it was totally shifted my ethnocentricity. Excellent. It totally shifted my sort of thinking that Siberia is the back of the beyond. It's not the back of the beyond. It's somebody else's heart.
I was just telling the audience that I was surprised to learn reading this book that you don't speak Russian, nor do you play the piano. Has that changed?
I tried to speak Russian. My husband bought me Russian lessons for my Christmas. I found it hard, and I also had to work. I had to work at a level that required nuanced interpreting. And I'm used to doing that as a journalist, but I wish I did speak Russian. And in terms of music, I'm not a pianist. I wish I were. But I appreciate music. I love music. And I don't think you have to be able to write to enjoy a good book. I don't think you have to play the piano to love listening to it for 3 hours.
No, well, you quote Tchaikovsky, who says, I'm juggling with things here, who says, well, you tell me what he says, because I've lost my little bit of script. He says, there would be reason to go mad if it were not for music. Now, I have to say that's very true for me at this moment. I mean, this period we're living through, without Radio 3, I don't know what I'd do. Do you agree?
Yeah, I do. I think that there were so many stories where I discovered the solace and redemptive power of music in difficult circumstances. And of course, that reaches right into the Gulag history of Siberia. up in Kolyma, which was what Solzhenitsyn called the worst. These were the labor camps were utterly brutal. And I encountered stories there of people like Zadaratsky. He was the last Tsarevich's piano teacher. And he had written, I think it was something like 22 little tiny squares of paper. He'd written these preludes, and he'd done it at a time where even being caught with pen and paper, you'd be killed. So he was using music there, even though he didn't have access to an instrument, to kind of hold on to something beautiful in a place of absolute horror. There were various stories like this. I think the one which really resonated with me was a story about a lady called Vera Shevchenko.
Oh, we'll come on to Vera at the end. I'm going to pause you there because I'd like to end with her, because she's and also I'm obliged to. I would like to take some questions from the audience. There's one here from Harvey, who says, is there anywhere else in the world you would want to explore in the same way you did Siberia?
Yeah, Sahara. Interestingly, one of the things, I'm glad you asked that question, Harvey, because one of these things, the things that this book unleashed was a series of connections with people who had stories about pianos that meant something to them, either in Russia or elsewhere, and they'd lost them, and it meant something to them. And there was one woman who got in touch with me from America who remembered in the 60s hearing about a piano in the Sahara, and together, it was a piano story that made her feel it was possible to have music in the proverbial back of beyond. And between us, we tracked down where she'd heard this story in the 60s. And it was amazing. It was a piano that was encased in plaster. And it was thought to have been taken during the war by Rommel's lot, passing through Siena. And it was encased in plaster and found in the Sahara during that great campaign across North Africa. And it was recently sold at auction in Israel. Kind of amazing. So I want to write a story about the lost pianos of the Sahara, but I think maybe I've beaten that drum long enough. But yeah, there's lots of places I'd like to go and look.
You say that this book is a personal literary adventure. What did you mean by that?
Personal because it allowed me to really spread my wings, if you like, in territory. I'm a traveller, and I've made my living as a travel journalist for years. And this was one where I could really embrace the things that matter to me personally: serendipity, friendship. I like people. I'm an extrovert, and I like the people I met in Russia through this journey. And it became very personal. There are deep friendships that have evolved out of it, and I hope I'll hold on forever. From a literary point of view, if I have one regret, it's that I didn't spend twice the amount of time doing it, because the literature in translation is just stunning. And, to read the entire body of work that Chekhov produced would take 6 months of real engagement. So I'm sad that I didn't have longer, because to immerse oneself in the books of Russia, about Russia, the non-fiction, the music, was a really enjoyable part of the whole project.
How long did you spend traveling Siberia, doing the research for this book?
Well, I went to Mongolia in 2015, and then I kind of got into it in March 2016, and then I worked until I had to file the piece. So I think that was August 2019. Yeah. And what did I discover is quite tricky. Russian visas are quite tricky, and I did it right to, I think I was 24 hours off what I was allowed to have in that period of time.
Well, I hope we've given you a flavour of the complexity and the richness of this book. You mentioned the Siberian tiger country. You actually saw a Siberian tiger.
I did.
I didn't know there was a Siberian tiger, to be honest.
Yeah. Yeah, the Amur tiger. There's about 500 of them left in the world. And on my second day in Russia, right at the beginning, I encountered one of these wild animals in the forest. And it was a moment. I was with a conservationist, and you're lucky enough as a professional conservationist to encounter one of these animals maybe once or twice in your career. So he was speechless. And when I told him what I was doing with the piano idea, he said, "My goodness, if you can find a tiger, you'll be fine on pianos. So of course you must do it." And he did it with a straight face, thinking it was utterly unpeculiar. So
we have a question here from Mary in Glasgow. Is the love for these pianos being passed on to the next Siberian generation?
Yes, in that photograph, Mary, that we saw of the piano tuners with the young boy in the red shirt, yes, it is being passed on. But like the world over, it's it's changing. It's changing. If you don't have a piano making industry, something is lost. And on that very week that I saw the Siberian tiger in the wild, the last of Russia's piano factories closed forever. And that also gave me a sort of sense of urgency with this project, that I wanted to tell its story before it had gone from our memories.
There are so many other individuals that we could talk about. Nina Alexandrovna, who knew the USSR like a cartographer. She also knew Eugene Onegin by heart, you say. The fisherman, Valentin Lecous, who sang We'll Meet Again. And some you've rescued from historic oblivion, like Sergei Volkonsky, who was banished, but he was joined by his wife Maria, who took his piano.
Yes, that's one of the great stories. And it was in the 1825-26, and you had this what they call the first Russian Revolution with these Decembrist revolutionaries. They were the sort of gentleman revolutionaries, and about 100 or so of them got banished to Siberia by the Tsar. And Princess Maria Volkonskaya took her piano with her and played it in jail with her husband. Wonderful book by Christine Sutherland called The Princess of Siberia, which tells that tale.
Andrew from Hereford asks, are there more portable instruments that are still in use in Siberia?
Yes, many. The violin, of course. I wish I could show you and just slip into this online presentation the image I've got of a young boy who was maybe 14 and a great prodigy. And I've got a photograph of him in Yakutsk. Yakutsk is in the capital of Yakutia, which is the size of India, just to give you scale. And this boy is photographed with his violin. What he really wanted to be was a pianist, but the instrument was too big for their apartment, and times have changed. So yes, violins, lots of violins.
Now, you mentioned Vera, so I'd like you to tell us about Vera, and I'm going to suggest that we give her the last minute of this fantastic hour, and say thank you to you for joining us. Thank you, Sophie, for writing the book and telling us about it. You can buy this, The Lost Pianos of Siberia, in the Wigton Book Festival's online bookshop. But tell us about Vera.
So Vera Lotar Shevchenko, she was French-born. And she was a great pianist. Le Figaro described her as sort of one of the great up-and-coming prodigies. And she married a Russian. And they moved to Russia, to Leningrad, where her husband was arrested and sent to a labor camp. Vera protested. So she too was sent to a gulag, where she spent 8 years. Her husband perished. We don't quite know what happened. Vera did not. She came out of prison and she walked into the street of the local town wearing her prisoner's pea coat. And she knocked on the first door of the first music school she could find and asked if she could play one of their instruments. Of course, they said, and in she went and started to play. Some records say 4 hours, others 8 hours, this magnificent score of Chopin, Bach, Liszt. And it was music that she'd held in her head throughout that experience in the Gulag. It was music that she had practiced on a keyboard that her friends in the Gulag had carved into the side of her wooden bunk. And she then found, she never left Russia, she never left Siberia. She found a future in the academic city of a science city called Akademgorodok outside Novosibirsk, where I found her last piano. And I also found her last tuner, who rather remarkably had survived the siege of Leningrad. So it was a very moving culmination of stories around an instrument that had been sitting in a back room gathering dust. And that, to me, justified the eccentricity, if you will, of the whole endeavor, because it allowed me to tell a story that otherwise could have been lost. And so maybe we should play a little bit of her music. It's not a great recording, but it certainly gives the spirit of the woman, Vera Lotar Shevchenko.
Sophie, thank you.
Thank you very much.